Thank you very much. It's great to be back at the meeting of FIRE. A few years ago, I gave a keynote at the larger FIRE event in defense of free speech, and I did not want to either to repeat that lecture or to provide you with still more defenses of free speech, a point I don't feel has to be made in this crowd. So instead, I thought I would speak on controversy, occasioned by a happy event in my life 3 nights ago where I got a prize for the defense of controversial positions from Simon Fraser University, which was a source of both pride and a little bit puzzlement because I never really thought of myself as particularly controversial, but I guess I must be. And reminders have come in, including just in the past year, of accusations that I am increasingly reactionary. I am just one step short of Breitbart. I'm the world's most annoying person. A number of articles on me have been laced with profanity, not from internet trolls, but from professors at universities. So something that I have been saying must be controversial. But when, at least in my own view, I would seem to be an unlikely controversialist, beginning with my politics. For example, I am a supporter of this man, the Prime Minister of my home and native land, Canada. Now, of course, Justin Trudeau is controversial, but he has been elected Prime Minister twice, and you hardly deserve a medal for saying that you think he's an okay guy. Likewise, another flaming controversial leader that I am happy to be in the company of is this man here on the left of your picture. Now, I deserve no credit for being photographed in the same room as former President Barack Obama. The person at the center of this photograph is my spouse, Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein, and this was the occasion of her having won the National Medal of the Humanities, draped over her neck by President Obama, and I was happy to be there as a trailing spouse. But it's not as if the connection is completely fanciful, because Obama's speechwriters had been in touch with me. Obama famously said that if you had to pick a time in history to be born, you'd pick now, a statement that I very much agree with. And at one point, his speechwriters contacted me to help with some fact-checking on human progress. Another intermittently controversial politician that I've been associated with is the woman on the left. I've never been married to the woman on the right, that's Cher. But this was at a campaign rally at which Cher introduced Hillary Clinton, and I was there, and I am indeed, or was a supporter of Hillary Clinton. Again, certainly a controversial position, but not the kind of thing that would get you compared to Breitbart or increasingly reactionary. And indeed, you could look it up. I am a supporter of the Democrats. I was the third largest supporter of the Democrats in 2016, according to the Harvard Crimson. Finally, one more person that I've had the pleasure of being associated with, that kind of rather schlumpy-looking man over there, is the winner of the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize, Juan Manuel Santos, the former president of Colombia, and by far my most famous co-author. When Colombia signed an agreement with the FARC guerrillas in 2016, it put an end to the last war in the Western Hemisphere and the last war left over from the Cold War. And through mutual contacts, I suggested to President Santos that this milestone be marked in an op-ed, and we got to collaborate on it. Now, this is, in terms of the themes that I have propounded over the last 6 or 7 years, they include a number of historical declines that I am rather happy to have celebrated: the decline of war, of extreme poverty, of autocracy, capital punishment, violence against women, violence against children, racist, sexist, homophobic attitudes and laws. Again, you wouldn't think it would be terribly controversial to argue that all of these are very good things. I support strong action on climate change. So I'm not a climate denier, which would be certainly a lightning rod for controversy, including carbon pricing. Somewhat more controversial, I have supported nuclear power, since it is the most scalable, abundant form of carbon-free energy. Although even there, I'm echoing a point made by James Hansen, who probably more than any scientist in the world brought climate change onto the world's agenda. So again, I would say this is not a far out on the fringe. I believe in strong action on nuclear weapons, including, that is to minimize the chance of a nuclear war, including a policy of no first use, and eventually the total elimination of all nuclear weapons, global zero. Again, that might sound like a controversial position, something that would be endorsed by beatnik professors and flower children. But in fact, this is a policy that has been endorsed by Cold War hawks, including Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. I've also suggested that authoritarian populism of the kind that has increased in influence in this country and Europe is the main ideological threat to progress. So these ideas are hardly kind of out there. They're hardly radical and extremist positions. So why is it that they have labeled me a controversialist? Now I have to add that this is not something that I feel I have the need to complain about or protest, that other controversialists have gotten far worse treatment. I've never been deplatformed, I've never had protests, I've never gotten death threats, and unlike many women who have expressed strong positions online, I don't get a fraction of the online abuse that many outspoken women have, including threats of violence. So this is by no means an invitation to feel sorry for me. No one should feel sorry for me, but an opportunity perhaps to explore what is it that makes a position controversial or a person controversial, which of course is very close to the mission of FIRE. So there are some reasons for my reputation of controversy that are no doubt idiosyncratic to me. I do have a taste for intellectual debate. It seems hard for me to deny that. I am a strong advocate of at least what I consider to be moderate positions, but when I believe that there is a moderate position, I will make a strong argument for it. And of course, I'm obviously wrong about a lot of things. How do I know that? Well, no one's infallible. No one's omniscient. And it is a matter of certainty that many of the positions that I advocate will turn out to be wrong. Now you might ask, well, why do you still advocate them? And the answer is, well, I don't know which ones they are. In fact, this is, those of you taking a course in epistemology might be familiar with the preface paradox. That is, in every beginning of every book in the preface, the author says, all mistakes in this book are my responsibility. And the question is, well, why didn't you eliminate all those mistakes? And of course, the answer is, you don't know which ones they are. But I will, the reason that I'm going to share some of these self-reflections with you is not, again, I hope not self-indulgence, but rather to perhaps identify some general reasons why there is perhaps more controversy than there ought to be about certain positions in academia, and I will focus the talk on those. As a preview, they will be the politicization of academia, the culture of intellectuals, and the moralization of intellectual issues. So let me just, as background, just to maybe reinforce the point that I must have some taste for controversy, given the number of controversies that I have found myself embroiled in my career. Talk about three academic debates that I was involved with far before any of the controversies that I wrote about were of broader interest outside the ivory tower. When I was a graduate student, I was one of the participants in what was called the imagery debate. This was a flaming controversy in my field of specialization, cognitive psychology, where the question was, does the brain represent mental images? That is, the experience you have when you close your eyes and you visualize something. If I ask you what shape are a German Shepherd's ears, most people say, well, I've never thought about that before, but now that you ask me, I can kind of visualize the German Shepherd, see the ears, and of course they're pointy. What happens in the brain when we do that? Are those images the result of brain activity that is in a kind of a graphical format, a kind of mental JPEG or image file that's distinct from language and abstract thought, or does the brain simply have one language of thought that underlies all forms of mental representation, including images? Well, under the influence of my graduate advisor, Stephen Koslin, I argued that with Koslin and with others, that the brain has distinct forms of mental representation, that information comes into the brain in a spatial format, that when we analyze the visual world, when we recognize objects, when we figure out what's connected to what, we form a more abstract semantic representation, and that is more propositional, more abstract, more logical. On the other hand, when we form an image, that is, when we have the experience of seeing something that is not there, we go in the other direction, top-down direction, and we recreate a visual experience from more abstract information in long-term memory. I tend to think that the debate has now been resolved by results from neuroimaging showing that visual areas of the brain actually light up when a person is not actually seeing something, but reconstructing the experience of seeing something from memory. But it would also not be fair to say that the debate is over, because the people who argued that imagery is represented by a language-like format then are still arguing it now. But that's often what happens with controversies. I was also involved in the language wars. Are children innately prepared to acquire the words and grammar of a human language? A hypothesis associated with my former colleague at MIT, Noam Chomsky. In my book, The Language Instinct, I argued with Chomsky that children are innately equipped to learn language, but contra Chomsky, that what they are innately equipped to learn is a much simpler system of grammar that Chomsky himself proposed, and that many of the phenomena that in Chomsky's theory of language are handled by syntactic rules are actually in reality, I argue, phenomena of meaning, of the conceptual structure underlying the meanings of words and sentences. And here I was been influenced by my postdoctoral advisor, Joan Bresnan, by my sometime co-author, Ray Jackendoff, here at Tufts University, and England's Geoffrey Pullum. Also, I suggest that language, contra Chomsky, is an evolutionary adaptation for communication, something that to many people's surprise Chomsky denies, even while asserting that language is an innate faculty of the human brain. It's not one, according to Chomsky, that evolved by natural selection for communication. In that regard, I was influenced by another great thinker who wrote, "Man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, while no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write." That is a quote from Charles Darwin, and it is from that quote that I got the title of my book, The Language Instinct. And in what at first might seem like the great academic tradition of knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing, I was embroiled in a flaming debate in the 1990s and 2000s, known in cognitive psychology as the past tense debate. And this is a question of whether it actually is a little more general and fundamental than just the question of how do we produce past tense forms in English, but rather, is the human mind a vast neural network, what today would be called a deep learning network, for those of you who follow artificial intelligence? That is the brain a more or less unstructured network of connections that is then trained by big data to associate some features in the input with other features? Or does the brain also contain rules that manipulate structured symbolic representations, more like a computer programming language or the rules of propositional logic? And, in my book, Words and Rules, and in other publications, I argued that the brain has a hybrid architecture. On the one hand, we do have symbol manipulating algorithmic rules for the regular creative combinatorial processes of language and of thought that feed language, that those are involved in pertaining to the immediate stimulus of this debate, the process of adding a suffix to a word to form a regular past tense, walk, walked, believe, believed, swallow, swallowed, but that we also have an associative memory, what is now called a deep learning network, that we use for looking up words, for irregularity, like sing, sang, ring, rang, spring, sprang, for idioms, like kick the bucket, buy the farm, spill the beans, and more generally for those cognitive processes that are driven by similarity and pattern recognition as opposed to step-by-step thinking and reasoning. And it turns out that the great past tense debate has been revived by my former student and collaborator Gary Marcus, who is probably today's most trenchant critic of deep learning approaches in artificial intelligence. Gary's book, Rebooting AI, reapplies some of the arguments that he and I made 20 years ago to the current limitations of artificial intelligence. But I've also been involved in controversies that have spilled out from the ivory tower that are of wider interest. In How the Mind Works, I argued that the human mind is a system of organs of computation evolutionarily adapted to the cognitive niche. That is, a way in which our ancestors survived and prospered in their evolutionary environment that combined hyper-developed capacities for social cooperation, for technological know-how, and for language. And that each one of these abilities reinforce the others. That's what makes humans such a weird species of primate. A corollary of that position, though, is that not all mental faculties are evolutionary adaptations. That is, traits that were selected for because they allowed our ancestors to have more babies than their competitors. That there are some parts of our psychology that may be byproducts of adaptations or products of random genetic drift. And they may even include some of the traits that we are proudest of or that we value the most, such as music. A perennial puzzle is, what is the adaptive function of music? It's rather easy to say why we are afraid of heights, why we fall in love, why we find our children cute, why we dislike the smell of rotting meat, but why we enjoy listening to sounds in rhythmic and melodic patterns is something of an evolutionary mystery. I suggest that there may not be any reason. And this is probably, maybe one of the most controversial claims I have ever made. I suspect that it will appear in my obituary, that I suggest that music is not something that evolved because it was good for us in the sense of allowing us to pump out more babies, but because it gives us pleasure. That music may be like cheesecake. Cheesecake is a megadose of agreeable sensations, sweet, creamy, rich, and that we don't have to explain why cheesecake is adaptive. It isn't adaptive, it's deeply pleasurable, and music might be the same. Anyway, people hate that. They confuse it with the claim that music is frivolous, not worthy of our support, and I will return to where that kind of confusion originates. In general, you can never, at least in my experience, you can never tell what will get people like really riled up. And propositions that I think are completely anodyne and innocuous turn out to be flamingly controversial. Such as, more recently, I have argued that among the humanity's greatest challenges, the fear that an advanced artificial intelligence will turn us into paperclips should not be one of them. That we just should not lose sleep over that. Anyway, people hate me for saying that. But that's another story. In the blank slate, I argued that the human mind is not a blank slate, not a tabula rasa, that there are genetic influences on our cognitive biases and illusions, on our selfishness versus altruism, on our sexuality, including differences in sexuality between men and women, on violence, on our aesthetic sense and personality, with a corollary which is considerably controversial that parents do not shape their children's personalities and intellects, that parents are overrated when it comes to shaping their children. This is not to say that the environment doesn't have a role in shaping our personalities and intellects, but that the child's environment and the child's parents are not the same thing. There are other environmental influences that have a stronger role. If you really want to make enemies, then express opinions about correct and incorrect grammatical rules. In the sense of style, I argue that many traditional rules of grammar, like dangling modifiers, fused participles, split infinitives, are superstitions and have no basis either in the grammatical logic of English nor in the practice of English's best stylists. And that it is certainly true that good writing deserves our attention and our effort, but that the main cause of good writing is not inattention to prescriptive rules of grammar, but rather a psychological phenomenon called the curse of knowledge. Namely, that when you know something, it's extraordinarily difficult to know what it is like not to know it. That we all project our own experience and knowledge and expertise on our poor readers, and as a result we tend to over-apply jargon and abbreviations and abstractions and abbreviations and generic statements that make perfect sense to us, and we have no idea that they make no sense to the people that we're communicating with. Getting still wider, it's hard to believe that there could be any topic that people find more controversial than fused participles, but a close rival is violence. And in The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, I presented data showing that violence has been in historical decline, that the data show that there have been at different epochs in human history declines in tribal raiding and feuding, in assault and homicide, in barbaric customs like burning heretics and disemboweling prisoners and slavery and debt bondage and dueling, in war, in genocide, and in violence against minorities, women, children, and gay people. But that the historical decline of violence is consistent with human nature. It doesn't mean that we are blank slates and we've been reprogrammed, but rather that human nature is complex, that we are not blank slates, and evolution did equip us with some nasty traits like the inner demons that make us violent, as I put it, exploitation, dominance, revenge, sadism, and a susceptibility to ideologies that justify violence. I think those are all built into human nature. But on the other hand, we also have better angels, as Abraham Lincoln called them, that pull us away from these inclinations toward violence. They include self-control, empathy, moral norms, and the ability to solve problems, reducing violence being a problem that we can or cannot choose to try to solve, and that the amount of violence in any society depends on the norms and institutions in place at the time that empower either our inner demons or our better angels. Documenting quantitative declines in violence awakened a thirst to look at other measures of human progress and how they have changed over time. And in Enlightenment Now, I present data that humanity really has made progress. This is not an expression of optimism. It's not a matter of seeing the glass as half full. It's a matter of plotting out measures of human well-being over time and seeing whether they go up, down, or stay the same. And in fact, when you do that, you find that many scourges of the human condition have historically declined. Violence, autocracy, poverty, disease, famine, illiteracy, unhappiness have all been in decline. I don't believe that that kind of progress just happens. I don't believe there is a thing called progress that magically lifts us ever upward. Quite the contrary, the universe tries to grind us down. But that Enlightenment ideals, the idea that we can use reason and science to enhance human flourishing, that is humanism, has been the driver of progress, namely that when people decide that the highest moral goal is to make people better off, to allow them to live long, healthy, and happy lives, as opposed to more tribal or religious or utopian ideologies. When they apply their ingenuity to that goal, every once in a while they succeed. If we accumulate the various tricks and solutions to the progress of making people better off, then progress can happen. So, why should these ideas be so controversial? Putting aside the fact that clearly I must have a taste for controversy, given how often I blunder into controversies. They never seem controversial to me, but then they wouldn't, would they? Well, as I said, there are, of course, legitimate intellectual reasons. The field that I work in, the fields that I work in, social and cognitive science, are hard. It's really difficult to come up with explanations of what makes us tick and how societies change that will convince all skeptics. Every claim must be contested. That, of course, is a good thing. And as I mentioned, many of the things that I say, and I have no idea how many, surely are wrong. But I'm going to suggest there's a little more to it than that there are other reasons why some of these claims, which at least I would argue should not be so controversial, turn out to be. One of them should be obvious to most of the people in this room, and that is that academia has become increasingly politicized. It always has been. But as Western societies in general have become politically polarized, and we can debate the reasons, social media are typically blamed for it, because social media nowadays are blamed for everything. I suspect that residential and professional segregation are at least as powerful a polarizing force. But we know, and data show, that academia has moved pretty strongly toward the left. Always had a left tilt, but the polarization in academia has increased, and as Jonathan Haidt has pointed out, almost everyone on campus now who identifies as a conservative is in their 80s. So this is not this is a situation that is likely to increase. As I sometimes think of it, academia is at the left pole. Now, just as when you're at the North Pole, all directions are south, the left pole is the mythical place from which all directions are right. And I have found that if you are not a hardcore leftist, in academia, you will be considered someone on the right. And as Jonathan Haidt has pointed out, pointing to survey data on academics' political affiliations, many departments in the humanities and social sciences, there are more Marxists than there are conservatives. So moderate centrist positions are often branded right-wing and reactionary. A second, and this is a phenomenon that cuts across the left-right divide, is that as C.P. Snow pointed out more than 60 years ago in his lectures and then book called The Two Cultures, intellectual life really is divided into cultures. Cultures in the ethnographer's sense of tribes with certain unstated, unwritten, deep convictions, a worldview. And there is, the two cultures that Snow identified were those of the sciences on the one hand and literary criticism, humanities on the other. Now this is, by the way, not a statement about humanities scholars, about historians, literary critics, but rather about a particular creed, a particular tribe, a particular religion that tends to glom together with the literary intellectual culture. And both on the right and the left, there are certain convictions. They're rarely stated explicitly, but they are very powerful drivers of emotion and criticism from literary intellectual culture. One of them is that science can solve some mundane problems. It can fluoridate the water. It can give us antibiotics, but must stay out of the territory of the humanities, that is science, must not say anything about politics, arts, or morality. To do so would be to commit a sin called scientism. Now, I've suggested that this is anachronistic, that just as during the Enlightenment, the great philosophes and thinkers were shifted from what we would now call science to philosophy, politics, history, arts. Not that they confused empirical issues with moral issues or logical issues. David Hume, in particular, was adamant that these must not be confused, but that they saw that they were mutually relevant. That is, they believed in what E.O. Wilson called consilience in his book by that title. Another unstated but surprisingly common attitude among literary intellect and cultural intellectuals is that the highest moral value is the creation, criticism, and consumption of elite art. Now, this might seem kind of bonkers, but it is, one sees it, I have seen it stated a number of times, beginning with the assailant of C.P. Snow in his era, a literary scholar named F.R. Leavis, who wrote in his rather vituperative refutation of Snow that science should get no credit for being able to reduce disease and poverty and hunger in the developing world, because what difference does it make if they can't appreciate great art like Proust? That's really what life is all about. And I have seen this argument reappear right up to the present. And another conviction coming out of what is sometimes called the a culture of radical oppositionality, or the hermeneutics of suspicion, is that literary intellectuals have to believe that Western civilization is in terminal decline. Western civilization has been on the brink of annihilation for at least 150 years. This was a theme that ran through Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Sartre and the critical theorists and the postmodernists, Derrida and Foucault. To say that Western civilization is not in decline, that in fact in many ways it's getting better because people are living longer and wars are declining and so on, gets people furious. As the way I've put it is that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. Some of the furious reaction has been, it is absolutely outrageous for him to generalize, being me, to generalize that intellectuals hate progress, and it's absolutely outrageous that he says that there has been progress. So compare, given this background, given these deeply held beliefs within the culture of people who write for various publications that begin with N, consider a view that I have advocated, that politics, arts, and morality must be informed by our best understanding of human nature from science, which is not to say they can be reduced to science, but they can certainly be informed by science. That beliefs about society are empirically testable. They are not just a matter of the most, well, engineers have a term for this, HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion. In the case of literary intellectual culture, this often consists of the opinion of those who are most erudite and have cultivated the longest history of deep reading. But questions about whether war has gotten better or worse are empirical hypotheses, and they should be tested by looking at the data. That we can use, that the highest moral value is life, health, safety, and happiness and education of humans and other sentient beings. That we can use knowledge and institutions to enhance them, and the data show that we have gradually and unevenly done so. A third source of controversy, above and beyond the controversy that we should expect and indeed welcome, is the moralization of belief. John Haidt has talked about how the human moral sense does not simply concern itself with what makes people better off or worse off, what's fair or unfair, but a number of emotional concerns and obsessions get a moral coloring, and empirical hypotheses are among them. People mistake empirical hypotheses for moral convictions. Intellectual argument becomes a kind of virtue signaling, Heterodox ideas are not mistakes to be refuted, but heresies to be punished and silenced. And a good diagnostic for when that has happened is when smart people disable their critical faculties and seemingly deliberately oversimplify the views of their intellectual adversaries, such as that X influences Y gets auto-corrected to X determines Y, X is one cause of Y gets auto-corrected, X is the only cause of Y. Let me give you some examples of some moralized hypotheses in social and cognitive science that I have run into. One of them, and these, by the way, are with the impetus for my writing the book, The Blank Slate, to try to tease apart the empirical hypotheses about how the human mind works from moralized implications that people, I argue, illicitly draw from them. One of them is, if there are innate differences between individuals, sexes, or ethnic groups, then discrimination and oppression would be justified. Now this, I would suggest, is an error, a non sequitur, an illicit inference, because fairness does not require sameness. The moral and political conviction that individuals must be treated by their merits, not prejudged by their group membership, does not require that all humans be clones and be indistinguishable. These are just separate ideas that we can let the data tell us whether men and women are indistinguishable in all respects without compromising on the principle that women, for example, should not be harassed, discriminated against, or belittled. Another one, if humans have nasty traits, then social reform would be impossible because you can't change human nature. Because social reform is a cause dear to our hearts, it must not be true that human nature exists. Again, this is a non sequitur in both directions. And as I have already explained, if in fact human nature is complex with both inner demons and better angels, some human faculties, such as our capacity for language, our capacity for thought, reason, problem solving, are combinatorial productive systems that can think up new solutions, new norms, new institutions. So it is not mystical or utopian or romantic to say that even though we are made of crooked timber, we have inherent flaws because of our evolutionary origins, nonetheless, progress is possible. A third class of moralized hypotheses is that what's natural is good. So nepotism and sex differences and aggression and revenge and so on, since those are bad, they must not be innate or evolutionarily adaptive, because if they were, that would suggest they were natural and good, and we must not allow that to happen. Though in an interesting twist, consistent with this moralization, I have found that there are certain traits where the politically correct position is that they are innate and Darwinian adaptations, in particularly when it comes to homosexual orientation, then the good and bad positions are inverted. Here it is politically good to say that homosexuality is innate and bad to say that it's learned. Well, why? So the illogic goes, if it is innate, then you can't blame gay people for their sexual orientation, and it would be futile to try to change it or to prevent gay teachers and Boy Scout leaders and so on from converting boys to homosexuality. If homosexuality is innate, then all of those are moot. Similarly, people, I have found, desperately want music to be an evolutionary adaptation, because that would seem to validate it as something worthy, valuable, salubrious, and so on. Now, I think it should be obvious that these are fallacies, and fallacies that have been recognized for so long that they've been given names. G.E. Moore, more than a century ago, identified the naturalistic fallacy that is implies ought, hearkening back to David Hume. And the converse of the naturalistic fallacy humans are aggressive, therefore war is good, would be the moralistic fallacy. War is bad, therefore humans cannot be aggressive, that it ought implies is, and that they are fallacies, as one would expect by what they're called. Finally, a final moralized hypothesis that I run into is that if you say that we've made progress, that would be to encourage complacency, to justify the status quo, to say everything is perfect, that neoliberalism has worked and we can just sit back and relax. Since we may not accept any of those propositions, we must deny that progress has taken place. I argue that, in fact, something can decline without it disappearing. There's no contradiction between saying that extreme poverty has declined by 75% in the last 3 decades, and more than 700 million people live in extreme poverty. Those are both true. For something to decline does not mean that it has disappeared. If there are fewer people living in poverty, that's not the same as saying that there are no people living in poverty, and that we can, indeed, we should commit ourselves to reducing extreme poverty to zero. In fact, being emboldened by the fact that we have reduced it already as far as we have. Moreover, progress is not a miracle. Progress does not consist of everything getting better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would not be progress. That would be magic. And progress is not magic. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that must be solved in their turn. Also, even if, though there would be dangers to complacency if we were unaware of the injustices and suffering that continue to exist, there are also dangers in thoughtless pessimism, in being unaware of the progress that has demonstrably taken place. One of them is fatalism. If you think that the world, despite all of the efforts of people to make the world a better place, things just get worse and worse, the natural conclusion is, well, why bother? Why throw good money after bad? Why waste time on a hopeless cause? And a complementary danger is radicalism. If you think that our institutions are all failing and beyond all hopes for reform, you'll be open to calls to smash the machine, to drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, in the hope that anything that rises out of the ashes is bound to be better than what we have now. Let me wrap up by saying a few words in defense of controversy and why universities should recommit themselves to free speech, open debate, and constructive disagreement. Preaching to that group of people who all sing together in church, that cliche. But nonetheless, let me reiterate some of the reasons. What are the reasons to encourage open debate? Well, the first one is it's the only way to acquire knowledge. No one is infallible or omniscient. No one has been vouchsafed with the secrets of the universe. No one has been endowed with the gifts of augury or prophecy or certainty. The only route to empirical knowledge is what Karl Popper called conjecture and refutation. You must propose candidate explanations and see if they withstand attempts to falsify them. If the first part of that cycle is, of course, proposing candidate explanations, if you are punished or shamed for even broaching an idea, then progress is impossible. Open debate and free speech is also the way to puncture spirals of silence, or as it's called, pluralistic ignorance, the state in which no one actually believes something, but everyone thinks that everyone else believes it. The paradigm case being binge drinking. It turns out that if you interview a bunch of fraternity bros individually, they all agree that it's really stupid to drink until you puke and pass out, but they say there's nothing they can do about it because all the other bros think that it's cool. And you interview every one of them, and you find that no one actually thinks that it's cool to drink till you puke, but each one mistakenly believes that everyone else believes it. And those can overcome a closed group of people, and the way in which such bubbles can be pierced is when someone blurts out the obvious in the presence of everyone else. The paradigm case being the story of the emperor's new clothes, which when the little boy said the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything they didn't already know. They could see the emperor was naked. But there is a change in their in status that takes place when something is voiced in a public setting. Now everyone knows that everyone else knows that everyone else knows that everyone else knows that the emperor was naked. And that is what in the story empowers them to challenge the authority of the emperor by laughing at him. And more generally, a lot of social change happens when a position that people may have believed in private but were punished for saying in public gets blurted out. Pointedly, open debate is the only way to make moral progress, not just empirical or factual progress. And in another, I guess, epiphany in my own professional career, in studying the drivers of progress, I was surprised at how often positions that now seem beyond debate were controversial in their day. So for example, nowadays, most college campuses would not have a Oxford-style debate resolved, we must burn heretics at the stake. 2 minutes for the opening statement pro and 2 minutes for the opening statement con, and then there was 1 minute rebuttal and 1 minute. I mean, that's kind of a done deal. We all agree that you should not burn heretics. However, in the day, that was debated. And Sebastian Castellio, for example, articulated a brilliant and I would say utterly convincing reason why it is not acceptable to burn heretics. Not just, oh, that's so outrageous and icky and obviously we shouldn't even think about it, but here are the reasons. Of course, it didn't carry the day. He got burned at the stake. But unless it is eye-opening to see that this was, in its time, an open issue, and that we remember the positions today because, or at least we can find them if we go back to the history, because controversial though they were in their time, they did, each one of them, begin a movement that culminated in the moral progress that was so successful that we take it for granted today and don't even realize that these were controversial in their time. Criminals should not be tortured to death. Should we have a debate on the pro and anti-disembowelment policy? Well, thankfully, not anymore. We have the Eighth Amendment prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, which in its day applied to things like breaking people on the wheel. But Cesare Beccaria articulated an argument why, even though bad people should be punished, even though one way to punish people is to torture them to death, here are reasons why criminal punishment should not work that way. War should be eliminated. Even when certain wars today are justified, say overthrowing Gaddafi or fighting back against Assad, the arguments are all that war is a regrettable means to a desirable end, peace, democracy, and so on. No one argues anymore that war is inherently good because it calls forth qualities of heroism, self-sacrifice, camaraderie, and that we need to go to war every once in a while to safeguard against hedonism and consumerism and selfishness and effeminacy. In fact, even articulating what I just said sounds barking mad to us today, but it was closer to a consensus in the years prior to World War I, which kind of put the kibosh on that style of argument. But that is what many intellectuals, politicians, thinkers, moral heroes of the time actually believed. And you could see people making the case for war as an inherently praiseworthy, moral, spiritual human activity. They eventually lost. I mean, it wasn't just debate, it was also the carnage of World War I, but it was, in its time, it was controversial. And those like Bertha von Sutter, who first made the argument that that the world should eliminate war were shouted down and howled at and ridiculed in their day. Today we realize they were right. Slavery should be abolished, as you all know. There were debates on that. Homosexuality should not be punished. Jeremy Bentham made a beautifully concise and convincing argument on that. Women should have equal rights, and so on. In another, vicarious or borrowed claim to fame, Rebecca Goldstein, my other half, and I were turned into cartoons in a TED Talk. You could look it up. Does Reason Advance Human Well-Being? In which each of us were cartoons arguing that resolution back and forth. You could look it up on TED.com. And we even hired actors to voice verbatim the arguments that had been made centuries ago on why barbaric practices of the time ought to have been abolished. Another reason to encourage open debate is that it's necessary to secure the credibility of university research in general on issues such as climate change and gun violence, often dear to those who are left of center. On a number of occasions, when I have found myself in the company of libertarians or people on the political right who challenge me on my advocacy of strong action for climate change, they say, well, yeah, you keep saying that this is there's an overwhelming scientific consensus, but what does that mean? Everyone knows that universities are just echo chambers of politically correct beliefs, and if anyone did have a dissident opinion, they would be deplatformed, shouted down, and driven out of academia. So the scientific consensus means nothing. Now, they're wrong. The scientific consensus is legitimate, but if universities fail to safeguard their credibility as arenas in which any position, including politically unpopular ones, can be voiced, analyzed, and when they are wrong, refuted, then we have, as professors, as people affiliated with universities, have ceded our credibility, including on cases in which we need it the most. Finally, open debate, I have found, is necessary to prevent perverse backlashes. The regressive left is an incubator of the alt-right. And I say this from some painful experience when I have seen some former students of mine who have gravitated to the alt-right because they see what happens in universities when positions such as that there may be sex differences or cultural differences are immediately squashed. The people voicing them are punished, and their reaction is, well, you can't handle the truth. They tend then to form their own self-contained bubbles, and in which far more extreme and radical and unsubtle positions can gain a footing, can fester unchallenged because they're in their bubble, academia is in its bubble. And so in cases like sex differences, police shootings, and the advantages and disadvantages of capitalism, you can get extreme versions cultivated in alt-right and other non-academic circles precisely because these are debates that don't take place in refereed forums in which the flaws in the extreme versions can be pointed out and mitigated. So let me sum up. Some of us are more controversial than others, admittedly. Some of us are extremely controversial, despite what at least I would consider to be relatively moderate positions. Controversy can be exaggerated beyond what we should legitimately expect and welcome, because academia is becoming more politically polarized, because the intellectual world still falls into two cultures, because empirical hypotheses are easily confused with moral convictions. But to reiterate a position that I assume in this crowd is not controversial, controversy must be encouraged because it's the only way to advance knowledge, it's the only way to make moral progress, it secures the credibility of the academy, and it prevents perverse backlashes. Thank you.